I think it's a possibility, and why not? If there's a possibility there, why not take full advantage of the possibility of liberation capitalism? A way of redesigning, or re-implementing, or rethinking technology so that it designs systems according to some of the insights of positive psychology and positive neurobiology, rather than the older pessimistic assumptions of an earlier age, designing a new types of systems, a eudaimonic technology that will open rather than close our humanity.
All right. Welcome back to the Musing Mind podcast. I'm Oshan Jarrow, and I am really excited to share this episode today. I'm speaking with Dr. Benjamin Hunnicutt, who is a historian and professor of leisure studies at the University of Iowa. He's the author of a number of books, two of which have been incredibly formative for me in the past few months. His work centers around what he calls the great mystery of leisure, which is roughly, and he'll explain this in the conversation, that for over 100 years, the American public understood that the point of the economy and the stuff of progress would be shorter working hours for all and more leisure time for citizens to more deeply explore and realize and develop their own humanity, their own freedom. And then, after the Second World War and the Great Depression, this broad cultural understanding just kind of disappeared. So that by 1980, no one even spoke about shorter working weeks anymore. The virtues of leisure were discarded and now seen as dangerous to society. So the mystery is what happened, and how and why did it happen so quickly, and what have we lost in the process? So we explore the history kind of from 1830 until today of the American cultural attitudes towards leisure and the political economy that grew out of those attitudes. We explore the present moment in American political economy, where the absence of a higher purpose than economic progress is leading, or at least implicated, to a series of crises. And then we explore a pretty wide array of strategies to reintroduce the ideals of leisure and higher progress, as he calls it, borrowing from Walt Whitman, into the American political economy in the transformed context of the 21st century, which brings in a whole new set of conditions. As always, you can find links and notes and more information on the podcast website. That's musingmind.org/podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, consider sharing it on social media or rating and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts, which really helps bring it to new audiences. Or you can become a Patreon supporter and help me grow the podcast by offering a small monthly donation. And that is all I've got. All right, so in we go. Enjoy my conversation with Benjamin Hunnicutt. Dr. Hunnicutt, welcome to the Musing Mind podcast. I am really grateful that you've taken the time to join me here today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
So there is a lot of ground that I'm excited to cover with you today, and specifically about the historical relationship between America's political economy and free time or leisure time. But maybe before explicitly getting into your work and the history, there's an interesting tension that seems to be resurfacing today that I think is emblematic of a lot of the topics I'd like to get into. You know, this idea that increasing leisure time for all is at odds or in conflict with more progress and more innovation, right? One of the concerns that people will raise about national programs that provide economic benefits that aren't tied to labor, and you know, might actually allow people to spend less of their lives working, is that we would sink back into this kind of unproductive lethargy. So again, the supposed conflict is that more leisure time is taken to mean less innovation, less ambition, less progress. And your work kind of directly grinds against this idea by situating it historically and showing the political and economic climates in which our attitudes towards leisure have evolved. So I wanted to begin by asking, what do you think we are overlooking or getting wrong when we assume that more leisure time means less innovation, less progress?
I go back to organized labor and what union leaders said for so many years, that the more dear, if wages get higher, innovation will be sparked. And the idea that people will be more inventive, trying to ease the burden of labor. If labor is paid what labor is worth, then there would be an incentive to find new labor-saving devices, and that would be a good thing, because it would mean more wealth, higher wages, ever yet higher wages, and short hours. Short hours and higher wages for organized labor for over 100 years, well into the 20th century, were the keys, the stimulant to economic progress. It's a way of encouraging the entrepreneur to find more efficient ways to produce things. And that's good as we become more and more efficient, eliminate more and more of jobs that are repetitive. Then it means that if organized labor and workers are able to share in that increase, and there's the rub, then it will all be well. Those two things don't go together. Higher wages and short hours are means to economic growth and a stimulant to economic innovation.
Yeah. Yeah, you actually you opened the final chapter of your book, Work Without End, with a dialogue that I thought summed up this view really nicely. There was a character who was expressing doubts about why, after so many years of supposed progress, we still toil as tirelessly as ever. Why can't we all enjoy the fruits of civilizational progress? He was asking, and another character responds, and I'll quote him here. So what do you mean? A little thinking, but not much? A little work, but nothing serious? No, nature drives. Now she wants to turn our very success against us and tempt us to be indolent, fantastic, idlers and pleasure lovers, betraying ourselves in another fashion. Let the new generation play, waste the life that is in them, a planet load of holiday makers, spinning to destruction, just a crowning festival before the dark. And this was from H.G. Wells's Things to Come in 1936. But there, for some reason, we've come to believe that free time is both socially and economically unproductive, whereas historically, some of humanity's greatest contributions, I'm thinking of a number of composers here, even Charles Darwin, who wrote in his free time, have come from what we would consider leisure time, right? Intrinsically motivated, self-governed pursuit of some topic that people find interesting enough and are curious enough about to devote themselves, not because they're going to get a paycheck out of it, but because they have some kind of intrinsic drive to study it. And this might be a good lead into, we talked about a little before the recording, but just to lay out for anyone listening, as a historian, you have devoted a lot of your professional life to explicit books and a number of other works to studying what you have called the great mystery of leisure, right, which surrounds something of an unforeseen mutation kind of in the American dream itself. So to begin, could you just give us an idea of what the mystery is and how you came to be so interested in it?
Well, I came to be interested in as a graduate student in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, writing a paper, a seminar paper, and then I wrote my dissertation about this very topic. I noticed a life-changing event for me as an article in Monthly Labor Review in 1972, I believe it was. Very few people have their lives changed by the Monthly Labor Review. But John Owens, an economist at Wayne State, I've got to know John Owens over the years. He wrote an article in which he said, in effect, that we've had no increase in leisure time since the end of the Second World War, and that sort of shocked me. That surprised me, and so I started, way back then, a long time ago, 40 years ago, trying to figure out what happened to this age-old dream, not so much ease, but opportunity to be freed from economic mandate, trying to solve the economic problem all our lives. Having solved the economic problem, this is John Maynard Keynes's phrase, solving the economic problem. We could solve it in terms of the basics of life and distribution, of fair distribution. We could solve that. And then after solving that, the great problem, the great task before us would be to solve the problem of living, of what is there to do in this freedom. And a lot of really smart folks through the 20th and 19th century struggled with what is there worth doing beyond necessity, not beyond working, having to, what is this content of free time? My third book, Free Time, The Forgotten American Dream, I try to outline, I give a catalog of the various people such as Walt Whitman, John Maynard Keynes, Frank Lloyd Wright, Julian Huxley. The names is all of my favorite people in the world who had this expectation. You go back to Jonathan Edwards back in the colonial days, who talked about the kingdom of God. And he thought, we would have the technology, the Enlightenment, science, we would solve the problem of making a living. Then we could get on with what is really important, our lives. So you had this wonderful dream that animated the 19th century. The work was important primarily because it was a means to an end. Throughout the 19th century, working hours gradually got shorter and shorter, cut virtually in half during the century of short hours. Then it stopped. And that article that I talked about, John Owens wrote that we'd had no increase in leisure after having cut working hours virtually in half, no one expecting the process to end. But end it did. I started following John Owen and his question, why did it end? He, of course, economist, asked the question in the monthly labor review as an economist, why did this process end? And he gave some extraordinarily good economic answers. What I've tried to do is follow along his insights and try to ask the question as a historian and try to come up with as many answers as I can through my scholarship. That's the focus of my scholarship, is to try, number one, to ask that question: why did working hours stop getting short when no one really expected it to happen? Quite the contrary.
Yeah, and one of the cruxes, I think, of your argument is that there used to be a very clear connection and even hierarchy between economic progress and this term that I believe you've borrowed from Walt Whitman, higher progress. And for a long time, maybe more specifically, maybe from 1830 all the way up to 1930, Americans were under no illusions that economic progress was an end in itself. As you've mentioned, it was always understood as a means. And beyond that, there was a very concrete understanding about how economic progress would serve higher progress, which was by the progressive shortening of labor hours for everyone. And importantly, right, this was not just for people who made it, not just for people who were meritocratically successful, but even the lowest status laborers, working in factories and the fields, everyone would have shorter working weeks and an abundance of leisure time.
One of the most exciting things that I came across when I was writing Free Time, The Forgotten American Dream, were some of the newspapers from some of the unions, the first unions in the United States.
Oh, wow.
In the Lowell mills, the women workers there, they had a publication, and I was able to get to the archives and have a look at the newspapers. I found in those newspapers writings of ordinary, the working women from Lowell, Massachusetts. And that the vision is there. The vision of solving the economic problem and then getting on. They saw the 10-hour day as one step along the way, a progressive shortening of the hours of labor, which was centrally important to organized labor in the United States until the mid 20th century and beyond. A progressive shortening of the hours of labor. The AFL talked about this in 1920. We start 10 hours, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, 5 days a week, and so forth. 30-hour week, they were struggling for the 30-hour week in the 1930s, and so on, until the balance shifted in our lives from making a living to how to live. That vision was clear from the very beginning of organized labor, and you can see it in these newspapers in 1830.
Yeah. How do you think about defining or gesturing kind of what higher progress is? And I understand to a certain degree this is an ineffable thing. It is embodied. It's very experiential. It's very internal. and it's very kind of endemic to the kind of interiority of being human. But that being said, I think it'd be helpful to try and gesture towards, to create the dichotomy between economic progress and higher progress. Marx, of course, talked about this in certain terms. He felt that the true realm of freedom only began once the realm of necessity ended, that they were kind of mutually exclusive. But how do you gesture towards what higher progress is?
Well, I understand it more or less as an opening, an arena,
Mm.
a new type of freedom that only the aristocrat had enjoyed before the coming of the machine age of technology. Technology
Yeah.
is going to free every man, every woman to live their lives beyond necessity. That's higher progress. Walt Whitman's view.
Yeah.
The vision of what's going to constitute that higher progress was quite complex. You had again, as I say, the third book, Free Time, The Forgotten American Dream, was a catalog, a variety of suggestions, of possibilities that Walt
Mm.
Whitman lists a number of possibilities that he thought would engage we would be able to do that would constitute this higher progress. Frank Lloyd Wright, one of my favorites, uh,
Mm.
I love to work with wood and a woodworker and build things, a carpenter. And he thought that this higher progress, we would all of us have a chance to regain the craftsmanship that had been lost with the assembly line. We would
Mm.
all be able to return to being able to make beautiful things for our home and for our neighbors and for ourselves outside of the marketplace as a hobby. uh,
Mm.
and he saw that the machine giving us that number one, this leisure. He thought that his buildings, he said specifically that his buildings, with the free space that his buildings provide with all of the new materials, was a metaphor for this new time, this leisure that was coming into the American economy, and he wanted to talk about that, to prepare the way. His buildings again embody that leisure that he thought would revolutionize revolutionize our lives. So again, the vision was very complex. It was not just one, consistent vision, other than we would have more opportunity to well, I guess I could make some general observations, more of a chance for self-expression.
Mm.
The artist in us would have a chance. We could return to making things as Karl Marx would have it, uh, and that would embody. We'd express ourselves. We'd embody our personality, our essence, in the products of our hands, and that would be for some writers the self-expression. Whitman also, self-expression with our words, social engagement, being able to live our lives successfully in the presence of other people, to share our existence with other people. That would be our main concern: how to build human relationships, how to cultivate things that we do together. God, I've got so many examples. Who was it? One of the writers of the 19th century. His name is Edward Ellery Channing, and I'm not sure that's
Mm.
a familiar name. We talked about dancing.
Mm.
This is also one of my favorites. He said, "We are the only people in the world, even then, that don't dance enough." He thought that we
Nice.
would have
Yeah.
the opportunity to dance, and that we would fill our lives with that activity that he thought would be especially attractive to us. Singing also, Jonathan Edwards. I'm naming things that I love to do. So, sing with people around us. Poetry, the word, the erotic word for Walt Whitman. We would make love to each other with our words.
Yeah.
And
Oh, I think you're right to. I think you're right to characterize it, and I like this framing that higher possibility or higher progress is an opening that
yeah,
an opening of the possibilities, whereas existing kind of entirely bounded within economic incentives has a kind of constraining, narrowing effect on what is viable for us to do at an everyday level and kind of at a broader existential level. Whereas the freedom from labor it by removing the absolute kind of subservience to economic necessity, meaning to what the market dictates as valuable, it frees people to explore broader notions of value, maybe beyond what the markets will immediately remunerate, but nevertheless are perhaps essential to the human condition.
Exactly. It's an old idea. I mean, the notion of human freedom and what is available in that freedom goes way back to the
Mm-hmm.
classical age, to the Greeks, to Plato. I teach Plato in my classes. The liberal arts, the original institution of higher education, the academy, Plato's academy,
Mm-hmm.
taught the liberal arts in order to teach people to be free, to teach people about this leisure. And they use the word. Our word for, and this is always a surprise to my students, and it confounds them for a while. But I point out to them that our word for school and scholarship comes directly, the etymology of the word is directly goes back to the Greek word skole for, guess what, leisure.
Wow, how far we've come, how far we've spun.
That's my point to my students. Liberal arts is not because it's a bunch of pinko type professors who are liberal. No, it's the free arts, the arts of being free. It's not teaching people to work. And then we changed. The education has done a 380 degree turnaround. So that it's going in the opposite direction, teaching people to work. Originally, it's to teach people to be free, and the catalog of what is there to do with this freedom. The struggle to answer that question goes back to Plato and Aristotle. So there's a lot of really good literature, classical literature, that's struggling with it through the Middle Ages. One of my favorite books that sort of got me into this field was Joseph Pieper's book, Pieper,
Yes.
Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And he writes about the Middle Ages and the classical tradition, the Greeks, that this was the leisure is the basis of culture, that our Western civilization was founded not in work, but in freedom. And what happens in the 20th century is that labor is successful in reducing working hours because of the machine. And so people like Robert Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, another of my favorite heroes, try to, as well as Joseph Pieper, try to wake up, try to bring back the old classical notion, the Greek idea of leisure. But what they're saying is that whereas this idea that leisure is only for the aristocrat, it's not going to do for modern democracies. But the machine slaves, technology has opened leisure for everyone so that everyone has access to the liberal arts. So
Mm-hmm.
Robert Hutchins, University of Chicago, tried to turn the whole institution, and they kicked him out. In the 1950s, he tried to turn the whole institution into recovering the liberal arts, teaching people, not only students, but also adult education is one of his big things, teaching people the arts of freedom, which were the liberal arts, and addressing directly what was happening. He saw around him, Robert Hutchins, working hours getting shorter and shorter. He saw that this old Greek ideal of leisure was newly relevant to the 20th century and to the masses, to every man, to every woman.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to do that. We had to do that. Otherwise, we would either ignore the possibility and re-enslave ourselves to work without end, the title of my first book, or we would have to relearn these old arts of freedom. Whitman is, of course, my all-time favorite, expressing this adhesiveness that we all feel that the marketplace can't bring us together, cannot establish the types of community that really give expression to our full range of humanity. The marketplace does bring us together in the sense of exchanging what we need, a tit for tat, a fair deal. if you're lucky.
Yeah.
But
That was one of Marx's, I thought, like great kind of insights and critiques of capitalism, was that what the commodity form does is it literally it colonizes and mutates the social relations that are established between people within that society to become relations of commodity to commodity. And what that does is it kind of transmutes the actual character of how we relate to one another.
yeah, commodification, Habermas's term, I certainly think that has happened. I don't think we're stuck there, though.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a possibility of I'm looking at out my window.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a bird feeder, and I think I see a scarlet tanager. Good Lord! I'm sorry.
No, that's worth picking out.
Uh, just a brief. My favorite bird in the world, scarlet tanager.
Really? Wow.
They're rarely seen, but I swear I saw a glimpse of red. Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a perfect like crowning metaphor for the higher progress narrative.
Oh, how we're going to get there. That's my latest effort. Looking around and at the political landscape, it doesn't look like there's going to be an open window politically for a long time
Hmm.
because of the strength of the right. And, things like Habermas. I certainly support things like guaranteed annual income and that sort of thing.
Mm. Yeah.
But I think there might be a possibility beyond commodification. Commodification, of course, Habermas's term is that those things that were done freely before capitalism comes along are brought into the marketplace, bought and sold, cheapened. The humanity is taken out of them, and we're left with false consciousness and with commodities that don't really satisfy our humanity. That humanity, in the sense that real community will. I think there's a new possibility out there. I'm not sure you want to talk about it, but what my latest book, the one that published this year, The Age of Experiences, I talk about the marketplace and its potential. I'm not sure you've heard about the experience economy or the transformation.
Yeah, a little bit.
Have you heard about it? Okay. Well, I think there's an opening here, a possibility here. The experience economy can be used to liberate. I call it liberation capitalism. The free market, by offering products, experience products that truly make people happy in the sense of community, in the sense of self-expression, products that transform the individual, the transformation economy. The transformation economy are things like weight loss, travel and tourism, things that change the personality. But if you go to the marketplace and are transformed by the market, buying transformations, making changes in your life, acquiring skills, for example, this is my best example. Acquiring skills that you use later on. For example, my wife and I love to dance, as I mentioned before, ballroom dancing. We're in our 70s, and we love this activity. We can't do it anymore, but everything shut down. But we spent money learning how to dance. We go to ballrooms and still pay our money. We're part of an economy. But in these dance lessons, we acquire the skills, the means of production. We're investing our time acquiring a portfolio of skills that we then employ, that we use to create the product, the experience product that we want all along, i.e., being able to dance, learning new dances. The better we get at our dancing, the better the experience is. The experience is what the product that I want. So my wife and I begin increasingly, this is Marx's term, to own the means of production. I don't need to go to the marketplace.
So it's like the market is the kickstart. You get it, and then you get out of the market, and you've already acquired the skill.
Liberation capitalism. The market provides the skills, the wherewithal. It is a catalyst to transform individuals, to teach skills, to teach enthusiasms that the consumer begins to own work and leisure become the same thing. I call this intrinsically motivated productive consumption. What is required is less and less money and more time. The demand for time then to consume what I want to consume, this product, this experience product, where work and leisure are the same, requires, again, more and more time. Value flows from the marketplace to the new economies more and more in the form of time rather than value flowing as money.
Right. That's really interesting.
The theory is that the income effect will become stronger and stronger with the experience and transformation economies, and the demand for time ought to begin to be greater, so that will stop. That will return to an earlier stage of economic development when the demand for leisure that was still strong. During the 19th, 20th century, the demand for leisure in the economy was strong, so that with higher wages, with better productivity, people chose higher wages, of course, but also shorter hours, combining the two. So there was this demand for leisure. It stopped. The substitution effect began to take over in the 20th century. What I predict here is with the experience economy and transformation economy, the income effect should strengthen, and with the strengthening of the income effect, demand for leisure will become greater, and working hours ought to, in these new economies, leisure should begin to increase. That's liberation capitalism.
Liberation capitalism.
Where individuals in the marketplace will decide, well, I need my time more than I need money to buy those things that I want. So they will be taking their time. They will be leaving the marketplace, leaving the profits that they had previously spent their lives creating for the very wealthy, and reclaiming their own lives, and there is no wealth but life, reclaiming the profit of their own life, reclaiming the wealth in terms not of money wealth, but in terms of time wealth.
Yeah, and what I'd like to do before commenting on that, I think I'll circle back to this towards the end when we kind of explore, how to get there, because that's a really interesting way of framing it all. But taking a couple steps back, and you've already spoken a good amount about the history, so we're not gonna retread too much terrain, but just to give listeners a bit of an idea, kind of building off the way that you put the history, and I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we can put the history into three distinct time periods.
Okay.
You could look at the time from 1830 to 1930 as the time when there was not only a labor movement, but as you've mentioned, a much broader cultural movement that assumed economic progress would naturally lead to shorter working weeks. And during this time, leisure was understood kind of in the same sense of ancient Greece as the destination of American society where we would more deeply realize our own humanity and so on. The next period would be from 1930 until 1980, which is where the virtues of leisure began to come under siege. This kind of new cultural ideal that was largely actually put in place by FDR's administration and the New Deal, which was moving from leisure to this term that you've used of full-time, full employment, which was at 40 hours a week. And leisure came to be understood rather than as a virtue, as an actual danger to society. And citizens were seen as not well equipped biologically or in terms of their skills to actually make good use of that time. And then this final period from 1980 until today, where we've seen a really remarkable development, historically speaking, where working hours have actually begun increasing once again, and largely off of the richest segment of society, kind of lawyers and investment bankers who are working longer hours than anyone else, which is really unusual. And leisure has been entirely discarded as this cultural ideal. And we have this modern era of workism and burnout and wealth inequality have all spiraled and took off. So you've already given us a good idea of this time from 1830 to 1930. You've given us an idea of the diversity of voices, from architects to philosophers to economists to working people, who the kind of cultural attitudes that prevailed. So I'd like to look at this time period from 1930 to 1980, when the narrative really started to change. And I wanted to ask, what you see as some of the most influential moments in both kind of precipitating the change and maybe culminating, right, the collapse of this broad shared cultural understanding, right? What were the big moments in this kind of tectonic shift?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I've really addressed that in my writing. I'll have to think about, of course, Roosevelt's administration and the people around Roosevelt who sort of laid the groundwork for work as an end in itself. The federal government, the whole purpose of the economy is to create more jobs. That sort of shift occurring during the 1930s in Roosevelt's administration, I think it begins a little bit earlier in the 1920s with the new economic gospel of consumption. But I think the people around Roosevelt were very instrumental in laying the groundwork for this new vision, and the federal government's role in maintaining full employment at all costs. After that, I think it's more of a continuum. Having lost the vision after the Second World War,
one thing that you mentioned that I really enjoyed, and this was related to FDR's administration, but when they were putting together the New Deal, one of the things they were, it seemed from your work, they were explicitly trying to do was shut out an existing bill that had passed the Senate, the Black-Connery bill, that would have reduced the working week to 30 hours. And FDR's administration, kind of contrary to at least my understanding of their kind of progressive vibe, was that they wanted to shut that down entirely. Right. So why was FDR so adamant about moving against these shorter hours?
Well, originally Roosevelt supported shorter hours. It is a gradual turnaround. Before 1935, he was on board. But then people around him, like Rexford Tugwell and others, began to press him and come up with a new idea. How do you deal with unemployment? Before, work sharing, shorter hours was a key solution to unemployment. It was only game in town before 1935. Right. Roosevelt, again, supports work sharing, but then the people around him, Tugwell, Hugh Johnson, and others, and the people around Roosevelt come up with full-time, full employment. The government maintains full-time and full employment, and it becomes the touchstone for political reform after Roosevelt's administration. Truman and subsequent presidents all use the same strategies to maintain full-time, full employment. Even Trump, with the stimulus, spend as much as possible in deficit in order to have everyone a 40-hour week or more job. That becomes the conventional wisdom in American politics, both left and right, follow along with that mandate. The important markers, perhaps after the Second World War, was when the possibility of work sharing or reduced hours reemerge as a possibility, and they do. There are bills introduced to amend Fair Labor Standards Act below 40 hours. And then you have the marshaling of support, bipartisan support, to maintain full-time and not shorten the hours of labor, as seen as something as a retrograde development.
Yeah, and there was one of my favorites kind of lines to kind of summarize the shift in the mood was from a report by the U.S. Department of the Interior that was released in 1974. And in that report, they had a line, and I'll quote them here. They said, "Leisure, thought by many to be the epitome of paradise, may well become the most perplexing problem of the future," which was actually a softer way of putting it than a number of other folks who were talking about how leisure would lead to sociological decay, would lead to crime, lead to idleness, and lead to lethargy. So it was really interesting that this was really that time where there was a 180 in the cultural understanding.
Well, I wrote the Kellogg book. I wrote Kellogg's 6 Hour Day. And I sort of focused on that consciousness change, perhaps. That there was this new understanding of work that I think is critical, developed slowly, but develop it did through the 20th century, from work as a means to an end, which I think was predominant in the 19th century.
Right.
Work as an end in itself, the center of modern life, of identity, of human purpose. That occurs in the 20th century, a gradual process. Work becomes, in my estimation, a modern religion, a center of our lives, the centering point of our lives. There's certainly a center of our morality.
Yeah. There was a Derek Thompson, who's a writer at The Atlantic. He put this really well. He said that what economists of the 20th century could not foresee is that work would become the primary means of identity production.
Right, right. It's a gradual process, but it's all around you. It's in the air.
Yeah.
The schools begin to teach people to work and to champion work's place in our life, the central locality of work in our life, and having no qualms about doing so.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And this is what I think made it such a dramatic shift. It is remarkable how quickly this major ideological change managed to sink into the background and no longer even be visible as a point of debate. That's what I think made it so total. And maybe right before getting into the kind of modern day 1980 to the present period, there's one idea I wanted to run by you and see what you thought. If we call kind of what we've been exploring so far as the story of the decline of leisure, I think there's another story that kind of runs parallel and overlaps with the time period that I've never seen explicitly linked. You do talk about a little bit about play, but I think these two have a lot to inform one another with, and I'd like to get your comments. So the other story, I'm working off the work of a psychologist named Peter Gray, and he writes about something he calls the decline of play. And he wrote a paper called The Decline of Play and the Rise of Psychopathologies in Adolescence. And the gist of the story is this, that from 1900 until 1955, historians of play referred to that time period as the golden era of unstructured play. That to be a child in America in that time period, when you got home from school, you ran outside, you went into the woods, you went into the streets, you met your friends. You were not kind of contained within structures that told you how to spend your time. And about 1955, you start seeing a steady linear decline in the amount of unstructured time that children spend playing. You see a big rise in the amount of time they spend in school. You see a rise in the amount of time they spend doing homework out of school. You see a decline in parents' willingness to let their children run freely. They grow worried about the dangers of society. A kind of sensationalized news media starts kind of highlighting bad news and kind of distorts our sense of safety. There's a growing economic pressure to structure your children's time earlier and earlier on so that they can ultimately get a better job. So all these things kind of led to a decline of unstructured playtime. And what he shows is then from 1955 onwards, you also see a steady rise in psychopathologies in adolescence. So things like depression, anxiety, addiction, hopelessness, things of that nature. And so his whole thing is to try to demonstrate a causal relationship between the two. But one element that I think is really relevant to the whole leisure question is one of the things that he says play does from a developmental perspective in children is that it increases what he calls our intrinsic competencies, which is our capacity to self-govern and intrinsically motivate our own behavior. And so one of the consequences you can see of less playtime in children is that as they mature, they're going to have a kind of decreased capacity to self-govern their own behavior, to self-motivate. And you can kind of see the parallels to leisure time. So what I wanted to ask is when we see this change in like the 60s, 70s, and really it's finished by the 80s, this change where not only is there an ideological move away from leisure, but people are starting to say that human beings developmentally do not have the capacities to make use of leisure. It seems to me that there could have actually been a kind of real observational component where the 1955, those children, they are coming into adulthood in the early 70s. There might actually have been some reality to the fact that that generation had, relative to previous generations, lower capacities to really make use of leisure time. Do you see any parallel there?
That's good. I'm convinced. I've never thought of that. Tell me the name of the play theorist.
Yeah, his name is Peter Gray. And he's still writing today. I'll send you over the paper afterwards. It's a really wonderful paper. It's succinct.
I've done a lot of work with play, not so much historically, but more in clinical settings. But in the recent book that I've got out, The Age of Experiences, I talk a lot about play and how play for adults can be a way to relearn
right
those competencies of freedom. That Peter Gray apparently is a damn good point. I'm so tickled to death to learn. I haven't thought about that that parallel before, but certainly now that you mention it, it's obvious. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't ever thought about it before. But
Well, you certainly wrote about play even in your first two books. I did read you were getting into it from another angle. So you certainly approached the subject.
but adult play is and one of the selling points in the experience economy
Hmm.
would be a play-like experience, an enjoyable experience, something that's
Hmm.
intrinsically motivated, that is spontaneous in the moment. That has a great potential to teach about this possibility of freedom. And for I think the generation from after 1950 can relearn through experiences that are play-like some of the competencies of freedom that we've left behind. We certainly don't learn them in our liberal arts, but maybe we can dust them off and find a new application for the liberal arts. But
Hmm.
that's an excellent point. For me, play is it offers a possibility to develop skills
Hmm.
sort of automatically that you don't have to be instructed about it. You don't have to have a policeman to tell you about, or a parent to tell you how to behave.
Hmm.
Learn coping mechanisms through playing. Play an emotion. I don't know if you know that, but
Mm.
neurobiologists have recently found that play
Wow.
is a basic emotion, which surprised the hell out of me.
Yeah.
It's closely associated with seeking behavior that all animals exhibit, uh,
Mm.
probing out into to the looking for, exploring. The play is an emotion, but it's the emotion of emotions. We can enframe other emotions, anger, for example. We can contain in the playground, contained within play, the emotion of anger, for example, or lust. We can contain
Hmm.
flirting. We can contain that emotion and learn to deal with it. Uh,
Mm.
Again, back to dancing, my favorite recreation. We're learning to dance, and learn to dance, you have to negotiate with your partner. And
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
have to learn a lot of skills, how to get along, how to cooperate. And you really have to, when you make mistakes, you control your anger or whatever, the emotions that you have when you're trying to learn something new with your partner. But it's contained within the dance, within
Hmm.
the playing, so that it's a play anger. With the example that I use in my class is I'm playing with my dog, and once we establish we're playing, the growl that had meant something different, anger, threat,
Hmm.
before the playing, before the sign, let's play, mood sign, let's play. After the mood sign, the growl no longer means the same thing that it does before.
Yeah.
Let's play. It's a play growl.
Yeah. It changes the entire perception of it.
It
Yeah.
does. I know it. I know that it's a playground, play growl. The dog knows that I know that he knows. There's this communication, amazing communication within the play field that goes on. So we learn in play, not just coping mechanism, not just exploration, but we learn socialization is what people used to talk about.
Mm.
But specifically, we learn how to get along with other people, how to negotiate. We'll learn how to communicate. We learn empathy, that there
Yeah.
is another person out there. So there's some damn good stuff out there about play that not just for children, but also its importance for adults, continuing that spontaneity and that ability to learn and to find new things that I'm finding today.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. And so maybe moving then into more of the recent time period, but this can
Okay.
really tie into what we were just talking about, right? Even just before 1980 in the 70s, you've documented how a number of progressive social scientists were beginning to think about how to graft and transfer the pursuit of things like autonomy and self-development and freedom onto the structure of modern work, right? And one of the examples that you zoom in on is the psychologist B.F. Skinner. Skinner being someone who had once believed that technology and leisure would liberate and improve humankind. But by 1971, you quote him as saying, so this is you, and then I'll transition into Skinner. You write that leisure is a condition for which the human species has been badly prepared. Mass leisure and its misuse had become serious problems because, now you're quoting Skinner, there has been no chance for effective selection of either the relevant genetic endowment or relevant culture. And now this is you again. For the time being and well into the future, the species would have to be managed by social engineers and professionals who found meaningful work for those lesser evolved creatures around them. And so you can see how this directly ties into what we were just talking about. And it's interesting that this is also not much different than what John Maynard Keynes himself had written. You know, he thought that once we did liberate ourselves from the economic problem, we would have this kind of uncomfortable adjustment period where he invokes the same language of genetic and biological kind of retraining, because we had for millennia developed around this kind of, ontological situation of scarcity and the economic problem. So this new language, even among progressive social scientists, that invoked the biological, the developmental, and I think most interestingly, the cultural inadequacy of what we have built and what we have become as human beings to make good use of leisure time. I think that's very. The Skinner example was really interesting because him too, just like I didn't know, but just like you said, FDR, he also changed his position. We see all of these folks who actually flipped their mentalities, who were otherwise considered quite progressive. So it was really a broad phenomenon.
It is. It's interesting you pick up on that. The psychology. Also, The Lonely Crowd, who's the author of that? My mind is not working. Lonely Crowd, do you remember? It'll come to me before long.
David Reisman?
Pardon?
David Reisman?
Right.
Yes.
He made the same change. He talked. He wrote a lot about leisure. I think it was in The Lonely Crowd and its potential. And then a few years later, he was 180 degrees that leisure is not a possibility because a human animal is a wretched creature after all, and he needs the discipline of work to keep him from doing all sorts of nasty things to himself and other people.
Right.
By and large, the psychologists of the 20th century were a dismal bunch of folks that had a very pessimistic view of humanity in general. More recently, within the last 20 years, you probably are familiar with positive psychology.
Yeah.
People like Csikszentmihalyi, Martin Seligman. I just talked to Csikszentmihalyi the other day, and high point of my year.
Oh wow, wonderful.
An older guy, but they pointed out, Seligman especially, that the 20th century psychology was all about what goes wrong with the human condition and what wretched creatures we are after all. And the best we can hope for is, to get back to zero, to trudge along and so forth. Seligman says psychology needs to be about 0 plus 1, about what constitutes human well-being, what constitutes flourishing. And guess what? Work is taking a beating. That leisure is seen increasingly as a possibility, a time to enrich our lives, where work is important, and we should do the best we can to find a place where we are content. But it is in freedom that human beings flourish. They have a different view of evolution, and they go back into we developed in our genes to be cooperative, to herd animals. We what Walt Whitman called adhesiveness. We bond together, and we enjoy that, and that it's not dog eat dog, struggle to survival of the fittest, but rather cooperation that is in our genes, and that is substantially what makes us happy. happiest.
Yeah.
They avoid the word. They use a new word they call eudaimonia, which
Mm.
is Aristotle's word, eudaimonia, for we translate it as happiness, but it's more than that. It's living a full life in which one expresses their full humanity. Um, so a new vision is out there, and I think that B.F. Skinner's and the gloomy psychology of it's still around, but there's another voice, another kid on the block, positive psychology, as well as positive neurobiology. The neurobiologists have weighed in too, talking about play
Hmm.
and how intrinsic motivation, joy, can be a powerful um, play a powerful role in our lives, and it's powerfully important that we're able to express that joy and find that joy in places other than the marketplace.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to talk about this shift in psychology and the questions of human nature. There was a Dutch historian, Rutger Bregman, who wrote in 2014. He wrote a book called Utopia for Realists that was kind of a pragmatic historical look at a number of what we would consider today radical policies, like a 15-hour working week, universal basic income, things of this nature. And so he published this in 2014, and then he's kind of asked the question, all right, you've laid out a very convincing case for why these fit the historical narrative, why they are economically feasible. What's standing in the way of actually doing these things? And he says, well, on my book tour and on this, I've come to realize the real impediment, the real obstacle are our theories of human nature. And so what he set out to do is publish a new history of human nature, which he did. He published it this year. I forget the exact name. I think it was something like A Hopeful History of Humankind. But one of the elements from that book that I really liked, and I think is very relevant to this discussion, he was talking about how the assumptions you make about human nature when you are designing a system, whether or not they are true, those assumptions wind up kind of reifying and imposing themselves as that system progresses. And there's actually a name for this. He talks about the Pygmalion Effect. But in short, you get what you design for. The assumptions you make about humans when you're designing the system will wind up influencing the way in which humans behave. So once everyone kind of bought into this assumption, whether true or not, whether based in this kind of developmental decline in intrinsic competency that I was talking about, the idea that Americans cannot make good use of leisure time, economic development from that point on began reinforcing that quality in human beings. So what Bregman would say is that if you don't want Americans to be lazy and unmotivated and intrinsically deficient, you need to proactively design and implement a system that trusts them not to be. And
Cool.
even if there are growing pains in the beginning, over time, what you have is a kind of the coevolution of the participants and the system itself. It will guide our evolution towards those assumptions. Would you trust in that kind of approach?
No, I think that's wonderful. I certainly agree with it. But I was talking before. I don't know if you want to circle back to that, but with the experience economy, I talk a lot about experience design
Hmm.
as a new technology. I call it the eudaimonic technology. Uh, that with this new systems approach to designing experiences, you
Yeah.
can represent those findings of positive psychology that are more optimistic, those things that really make us happy,
Yeah.
that fulfill our joy. Paying attention is an important thing. It's sort of hard to get it across quickly, but except by using examples. One of my favorite examples is my son lives on Riverside Drive in New York City, uptown,
Mhm.
not far from Harlem. And on Airbnb, I write about Airbnb and the age of experiences.
Mhm.
Airbnb, this new platform for experienced designers, is not only that you find a place to stay and sleep overnight, but also there's a new product with Airbnb called Experiences. You're in
Right.
a town like New York City and you're looking for things to do, go to Airbnb, and you have all of these entrepreneurs who are putting out designing experiences on their own for this young kid up in Harlem. And I'm going to do this, by God, next time I'm able to get to New York City. And I'm 76 years old, but I don't give a damn. I'm going to go over
Yeah, do it.
up in Harlem. This young kid for $100. I think it was $100. You go up there and spend the evening with him, and he shows you around.
Hmm.
He gives you, takes you to a restaurant. He takes you back to his studio and teaches you to rap dance, to dance street dance, to rap,
Wow.
and
You've
introduce
got to do this.
what
You've got to do this.
I got to do it. You see what that's doing.
Yeah.
He's embodying, he's opening my experience, my life. And as do you know Rick Steves, the travel writer, he talks about the value of travel being it's hard to hate somebody. You get to meet them and you get to know them. And there it is, a designing experience that takes takes the customer to a new place, to stretch the limitations, to open up to new possibilities, to play with another human being, to overcome some of the barriers that separate human beings from each other.
Hmm.
There's a potential there to design experiences that enrich, that produce joy, that produce understanding, that produce mutuality, and not to produce dependency, hostility, alienation, all of those phrases that Habermas and Gortz.
Right.
At least I'm a great fan of Habermas and Andre Gortz.
Gore. I just finished Gore's critique of economic rationality. It's of reason. It's one of my favorite books I've read.
It's powerful stuff, but again, I'm writing. I would like to think that the free market needs its chance. I think it's a possibility, and why not? If there's a possibility there, why not take full advantage of the possibility of liberation capitalism, a way of redesigning or re-implementing or rethinking technology so that it designs systems according to some of the insights of positive psychology and positive neurobiology, rather than the older pessimistic assumptions of an earlier age, designing a new types of systems, a eudaimonic technology that will open rather than close our humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a quote that you've shared. I've seen you share in a number of places, and you mentioned him earlier, Jonathan Edwards, an 18th century preacher. And it reminded me of a similar quote by a certain Ram Dass / Richard Alpert, a big Harvard psychologist turned spiritual teacher in the 60s. And I think that both of these quotes point, in a sense, to where we find ourselves today. And I wanted to share them side by side and see if we can elaborate on them a little bit.
Cool.
The Edwards quote that you share is, labor to get thoroughly convinced that there is something else needs caring for, right? So labor so that you realize that there is something beyond labor that is incredibly vital.
Right.
And then the Ram Dass quote, Ram Dass is sitting there's a gathering of people who've come to listen to him speak. This is when he's become the big spiritual teacher. He says, a lot of people come to me and say, Ram Dass, I ought to meditate more. I should meditate more. How can I do that? And I say, forget it. Don't. Go out and lust some more. Go until you are so nauseated by your own predicament that you yearn to meditate. Get so hungry for it that you can't wait to just sit down, turn off the television, turn off the drama, and just be quiet for a few minutes. And what these two things kind of both point to for me is this idea of committing yourself so fully to the world as it is popularly given to us so that you cannot help but reach the end of its rope and kind of see, there is something beyond what we have going here. And I think that if I can be kind of so crude as to talk about the American psyche, I think this is something that we're doing at a collective level, is that we've committed from this period from 1980 until today so deeply, so existentially to this ideology of work and economic progress absent any larger context. It feels as though it's becoming unavoidable that we're coming up against that wall where we realize there's something beyond it that we have neglected. And there's all these tropes now. There's Byung-Chul Han, the German philosopher who wrote a book to call the early 21st century the Burnout Society. We see deaths of despair and suicides are spiking, especially in working class demographics. We're seeing mental health in ruins and so on. And it feels as though collectively we're having this reckoning and we are growing so nauseated with our predicaments. We're yearning for change, but we don't know where to look and we don't know what to do. or we don't even, many of us lack, I think, the belief that meaningful change is possible anymore. This is much of the work from Mark Fisher and these folks who talk about capitalist realism, how neoliberal capitalism creates an ideological climate that makes us feel powerless to do anything to change it. A metaphor that I thought about that I think describes the situation is that we have sucked the oxygen out of the chamber that we're living in. And for the past 40 or 50 years, we have been slowly and progressively losing our breath. But we're still carrying on, only getting slightly more frantic, more on edge. But it seems that it's turning into louder and louder gasps with less and less time between them, right? So I wanted to turn all that into a question to ask, what role do you see the kind of loss of higher progress, the loss of what you've called the better half of the American dream, playing in the kind of series of crises, the series of kind of turbulence that we're living through today, the general psychological condition? Would you say it's fair to say this has much of its root in our kind of loss of a broader context, our kind of decline from looking beyond the edges of labor?
I agree, sure. I think we are, especially the millennial generation and generation after that. Young people are beginning to hit the wall, begin to doubt work as the center of life, to doubt consumerism and the wonderland of consumerism, to doubt the maldistribution of wealth. I think that all of those things are figuring into maybe the beginning of a new consciousness. I'd like to think that but how to nurture that? One of the findings of positive psychology with people like Seligman is that we're drawn to the future. That's his phrase. He wrote a book called Flourishing. And as positive psychology is all about the human animal as the visionary. He uses a Latin phrase, and I forgot what it was, that we are by nature drawn to the future. We like to think of ourselves as having a goal, a destination that gives purpose and meaning to our lives. So I think that vision thing is vitally important. It's the reason I wrote Free Time, The Forgotten American Dream, is to recover, to represent that wonderful dream, to inspire, but and then thereby to make a small contribution. And my teaching also, I try to inspire, to represent what inspires me with people like Walt Whitman and Dorothy Canfield Fisher and all the rest. But I'll continue to do what I can to say, that there's more to it. There's more to life. There's a possibility other than what we see before us. Work without it. There's a looking, exploration, and since it is out there, I think maybe I'm more optimistic. Maybe having worked till we got to a place that we understand there's something better to do, as Jonathan Edwards would say. We need to look around for something better to do than base our existence on our jobs or on the things that money will buy us.
Right, and it's I'm happy that you brought up Gores, because I had drawn a quote from Gores as well that I think really speaks to this kind of the ontological divide and status of a life confined by labor and economic incentives versus one that is liberated to broader possibilities. Gores was writing, so he wrote, quote, "Economic rationality, which is a particular form of cognitive instrumental rationality," which is a nod back to Habermas, is not only wrongly extended to cover institutional actions to which it is not applicable, it colonizes, reifies, and mutilates the very relational fabric on which social integration, education, and socialization depend. Are there not other types of rationality consonant with the ontological multidimensionality of existence? Now, Gores is he uses a lot of chewy language, but this idea of the relationship between economic systems and the ontological multidimensionality of existence has been ringing in my head. And I think that can kind of bring us up to today. We've pointed out the problem. You've mentioned, this is fascinating, and I'll want to circle into it. You've mentioned kind of the one approach to kind of reconnecting higher progress via the experiencing economy as kind of a market-based solution, which is really interesting. I would be curious how you see the pursuit of higher progress today, or trying to reintroduce this idea into the economic system and into the kind of cultural ethos, specifically the policies, the economic policies, if your approach is kind of the market is going to do this, and if we nurture this element of it, there's a lot of talk about more top-down approaches, which have a bad ring to them, but there's basically acknowledging that government is not this horrible miscreant, but government actually has very relevant power today. And so, in the 20th century, the policy platform that you've spoken about was really based on higher wages and shorter working weeks, which would be achieved either by individual firms self-selecting to reduce their shifts via work-sharing programs, or from national policy that would reduce the threshold at which overtime pay started. And a lot of this was based kind of around the employment structures of the time, which were predominantly factories. And these kinds of things certainly still play a role. But the economy is so much different than it was, right? It's become an open system. It's globalized, digitized, it's financialized. And I think this brings in a new spectrum of approaches, as you've mentioned and explored in your most recent book, that are relevant to this kind of new economic landscape. So even just to return to this old ideal is calling for new policies and new approaches. And one of the elements, taking the experiencing economy as one approach, I think another one that I've personally been very interested in and have explored on the show a little bit, is looking at the role that wealth and the structures of asset ownership play in granting democratized freedom. One of the biggest differentiators between the 20th century and today, in my view, is the dynamics of wealth. So not only wealth inequality, which has ballooned since 1980, but also the new ways in which wealth is created and captured. And it seems to me that wealth, maybe even more so than higher wages, is what really makes leisure time possible, in the sense that owning wealth or being included in the returns of the that assets generate give people unconditional income, meaning they receive income without having to exchange any time in return, whereas wages are still part of this exchanging structure. So one element of a potential return to an economy that generates leisure time for all, I think, could be a restructuring of asset ownership and more inclusive institutions of public wealth, or public-private partnerships that universalize the benefits that previously privatized wealth, grants to an increasing minority. And especially since 2008, but more so in recent years, there are a number of approaches that are trying to do this, trying to get beneath wages and redistribution, and trying to change the pre-distributive dynamics of the economy so that wealth is created and captured in a more democratic and egalitarian fashion to begin with. And the more wealth every citizen has access to, the more optionality they have over how they spend their time. And specifically, these ideas can be as familiar as something like universal healthcare. They can be as perhaps unorthodox as things like social wealth funds, baby bonds, royalties that every citizen receives on assets that are transferred from private to collective ownership, and so on. But overall, how does this idea land with you that in the 21st century context, deeper reforms and wage hikes might mean we have to look at things more flexible and democratic approaches to asset ownership and wealth?
Yeah. Whoa. I'm not as familiar with this topic as you are. You certainly know more of the ins and outs. I tend to support things like, as I said before, a guaranteed annual income. Other forms of wealth redistributions, I'm not that sure of. And I'm not sure that even those forms of wealth redistribution that you're mentioning, some of which...
That's fine. Let's take basic income.
Well, I'm not sure of the link between those systems of redistribution and leisure time. I think that the demand, or even legislation for regulating work hours, I'm not sure of that link. I've gotten to the point of thinking that in order, you can't make people be free. Mm. That the desire for being free has got to somehow precede the possibility. They're otherwise, you get people taking second jobs and looking at working 30 hours as a part-time job, that sort of thing, rather than being an embrace of the possibilities of leisure. So I tend to think that the demand for leisure should be there, needs to be there first, and it's really hard to make. What I think, though, is it's out there, especially in the demand for time. is out there. If there are some enlightened business people who, and you see this, I think there's a good deal of interest now in Europe with alternate ways of structuring a work week. Perhaps you've been reading about the 30-hour work week out of Finland, some of the Scandinavian countries, even France has been looking at it. The 4-day work week, have you been seeing that? Discussion out of the pandemic with unemployment, work sharing has, again, as it did during the Great Depression, emerged as a primary way of policy to deal with unemployment. And so you have a lot of people writing and advocating for the 4-day work week, for example, as an unemployment measure. You also have people like enlightened business folks, managers, who offer short schedules for people that want them. Lindsey Hahn in Nobleville, Indiana, Metro Plastics, his company does 30 hours, and he pays his workers pretty well. 30-40 it's called. He pays them 40 hours. They work 30, and he has no problem at all hiring people. People are eager to have wages. So I think that individual firms need to step up and offer those possibilities, and I think that's an avenue. But again, I'm sort of suspicious of the link between wealth redistribution and the demand for leisure. It seems to my thinking is that as human beings begin to demand more of their lives and take it back, reclaim their lives from the marketplace, from capitalism, rather than spending their lives creating profits for the very rich, seeing the advantage of spending their lives the way that they would like to spend their lives, doing things that they really would like to do, they enjoy. If that dynamic can take hold, then there would be an automatic redistribution with capital flowing from the centers, from the places where it's pooled up in enormous fortunes. What is it? 3 people in the United States own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population.
Yeah, some ridiculous number.
Well, that wealth will begin to flow from investment into these new economies, into people's lives, as they begin to actually make those choices in the marketplace, would flow away from capital into value, away from capital into time. That, I think, is for me, the more realistic, perhaps, a possibility, certainly given the political what politics looks like today. So that to me I certainly am interested and intrigued. Your citing of Andre Gortz, you read some of my favorite passages from that was his workbook, right? What was the title of it?
The Critique of Economic Reason.
Exactly. Yeah, that is a formative book in my life. But again, we'll see. Again, I think it's what I said in the new book, the Age of Experience, is that we're going to have in the next 20 years or so, we'll be running an experiment.
Right.
The contradictions of capitalism that E.P. Thompson, the British historian, teaches wonderful time, work, discipline, and industrial capitalism in my classes. It's a classic in leisure studies. E.P. Thompson talks about a novel dialectic that capitalism is haunted by a number of contradictions, among which, and I still believe that, even though some people have gone beyond that, capitalism has a premium on getting rid of work, of finding ways to replace workers with machines. But at the same time, they have the obligation, they have to propagandize work in order to keep people in line and also find a tractable labor source. So there's a contradiction. It's something that they have to propagandize. They have to make a priority and culturally. At the same time, they're destroying it. So that contradiction of destruction of jobs versus the propagandizing of work can lead to several syntheses, to use Hegel's outcomes. One of which is that the unemployment becomes worse and worse, maldistribution of wealth becomes worse and worse, until the system begins to implode, to fall apart, and dictatorship, the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat would be the result. The second would be the continuation of the exploitation of the leisure industries. He calls them the leisure industries, where work is still propagandized, but leisure is still used to support unnecessary consumption, keeping people at work, consuming things that they don't need indefinitely. And for me, that the continuation of exploitation, and the last is the possibility of continuing leisure, where workers would regain that impetus they had in the 19th century to shorten the hours of labor, and in that way reclaim their lives away from capitalism and have a peaceful revolution, perhaps a revolution of time that workers would regain their regain ownership of their own lives. You're suggesting perhaps a fourth in terms of government redistribution, but again, I think that leaves unanswered the question of where work figures into the equation.
And I think you're right that wealth redistribution, even if it's subsumed in a broader project of pre-distribution, even if it cuts more people into the unconditional returns on wealth, it's not going to instill the demand for leisure and for freedom. So it might just be reinvested into the existing ethos. Right. I remember, I think the last line to, I think it was your book, Free Time, was that free people choosing more freedom is the best hope that we have for the future, or something to that effect. I thought that was a wonderful sentiment.
Well, I still stand by that. I still hope for that, and hope to be able to find ways to make that happen, or to be on the side of that happening in some small way. Work is, I think, beginning to fragment, especially with the millennial generation. It's coming apart. The old 9-to-5 career, where you get a gold watch after 50 years, it's not there anymore. And the gig economy is a big thing, and the sharing economy is a big thing. Work is coming apart. Yeah. More and more work is being done outside of the context of the economy, where we own the means of production, and the giving economy. The sharing economy. We're finding ways of living our lives independent of the marketplace, of profit and loss, of capitalism. I think, to me, that's the more hopeful place, that work coming apart, we will naturally look about us for alternatives. That's a more optimistic point of view, I think, than seeing us running against a barrier where we are despairing because our work is not providing what we think it should, or we promised that it provide us. We would become depressed and so forth, suicide, because we loss of meaning, because we've lost this God. This is more hopeful, I think, that work. The young people in my life, they scare the hell out of me because they're not as concerned with things like retirement and health insurance, which I finally talked them into. Thank God for Obamacare.
Right.
My kids are all lined up there, but they're looking at work very differently than I did. It's not the center of their life. They are looking at other ways to live their lives, other centers, and I think maybe that's healthy, and maybe that's the point that Jonathan Edwards was pointing to. Work to get convinced there's something better in life to do.
Right.
Maybe the next generation has finally found that place.
Yeah, and I think Andre Gorz pointed pointed this out as well, that he believed something like a guaranteed income in conjunction with a program of shortening the working week, that not one without the other, but what these would do would essentially boost people's capacities and platforms to explore what he called these other ontologies. But like you, his hope was not that we would be able to impose freedom upon people. It was that we would be able to create the conditions such that people will naturally begin to demand more and more freedom. And there was a role for policy in that via guaranteed income, but there was also especially a role just in terms of the culture kind of beginning to shift, which I think you've done a lot here to point us out in the different areas that it's beginning to happen.
Well, I hope so. I'm delighted to talk with you. It has brightened my outlook considerably that there are people out there who are actually, number one, reading what I've written.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But are clearly interested in fighting the good fight. I think it's a wonderful cause, a cause to restore that vision, that purpose that for so long encouraged, that excited people in this country, throughout the world. And if we can bring that back somehow and re-energize, reestablish, that's something well worth doing indeed.
Dr. Hunnicutt, it has been an absolute pleasure. I've really benefited from your work.
And thanks so much. As I say, talking to you has cheered me up considerably.
All right. If anyone listening wants to check out more of his work, I'll have all of the books linked on the show notes page so you can get there. Benjamin, thanks again for joining me.
You're certainly welcome. Thanks a lot.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And I hope you caught the moment where he's interrupted by the sight of a rare bird. And you can hear in his voice, right, how struck he is by it. And I thought that was such a perfect demonstration of so much of what we discuss in the conversation. As I mentioned, the episode page on the website has links to the books and articles that he and I mentioned throughout the conversation, and more information on his books and works, which I highly recommend. If you want to stay up to date with the podcast, the website, which is musingmind.org, also has a newsletter tab that you can sign up for. I usually send about 1 or 2 a month, and I always include any new podcasts or essays I'm publishing, along with kind of deeper dives into the guests and their work and my own thinking. If you want to get in touch, I'm active on Twitter. You can just search my name, Oshan Jarrow, or you can contact me through the website or by responding to a newsletter. I really think that the history of leisure in the American context is worth bringing to a wider audience, especially today. So if you did enjoy, please do consider sharing it or checking out Benjamin's work. And that's it. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next time.